boarding door should have closed already. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The jet bridge groaned under a late surge of footsteps, the hollow metallic thud echoing down the narrow aisle as a flight attendant raised her hand, palm out, stopping a woman cold just 3 steps from the first-class cabin. The cabin was quiet, in that tense, early morning way, when people were awake but pretending not to be. Heads stayed forward, ears leaned in. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant said, voice tight, too careful. "You can't sit there." The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back either. She simply looked at the placard above the seat, 1A, then at the boarding pass in her hand. Her fingers were steady. Her breathing was not. "That's my seat," she said. It was a short sentence, calm, clean, and somehow it landed like a slap. The attendant's jaw set. Her eyes flicked once, fast, to the man standing just behind the woman in the aisle. He gave the slightest shake of his head. "Don't. Not here. Not now." The air inside the aircraft felt thinner by the second. From the forward galley, the purser was already watching. Susan Holloway had seen every kind of passenger in nearly 3 decades of flying. Loud ones, drunk ones, grieving ones, entitled ones. She had learned to read people the way some women read weather. The woman standing in the aisle didn't fit the picture her instincts had learned to trust. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Black, dressed plainly, no jewelry worth mentioning, no phone pressed to her ear, no assistant hovering. Just a dark coat folded over one arm, a canvas carry-on scuffed at the corners, and eyes that didn't beg or bluster. Eyes that waited. Susan stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the floor, smile already in place. Professional, polished, final. "There's been a seat reassignment," she said, not unkindly. "Just a small operational adjustment. We'll get you settled comfortably." The woman looked at her now. Really looked. Susan felt it, the weight of that gaze, sharp and assessing, like a hand pressing briefly against her chest. "I was assigned this seat when I booked," the woman said. "I checked in last night. I confirmed again this morning." Susan nodded, as if indulging a child who didn't understand how things worked. "And sometimes the system doesn't catch up in real time. It happens. We've prepared another seat for you." Behind them, someone cleared their throat. In the first row, a silver-haired woman shifted impatiently, her perfume drifting forward in a thick, floral wave. "Well," Patricia Whitmore said, not bothering to lower her voice, "we're holding up the whole plane." Susan turned instantly, her posture changing the way it always did when money entered the room. "Just a moment, Mrs. Whitmore." She turned back to the woman in the aisle, her smile thinning. "Your new seat is 23C. An aisle, plenty of legroom." "That's not first class," the woman said. "No," Susan replied, just as evenly. "It isn't." The man behind them swallowed. Jason Miller felt sweat prickling along his spine under his pressed uniform shirt. He had printed the boarding pass himself. He knew what it said. 1A, clear as day. But he also knew Susan Holloway's reputation. She wrote schedules. She wrote performance notes. She decided who flew holidays and who didn't. He stared at the floor, hating himself for it. The woman took a breath, slow, measured. For a split second, Susan thought she might argue, demand a supervisor, ask for names. Instead, she nodded. "All right," the woman said. "I'll take it." Relief rushed through the aisle, almost audible. Susan gestured forward, already turning away. Patricia Whitmore smiled, victorious, as the woman passed her seat without looking. No one noticed the way the woman's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. No one noticed the subtle change in her eyes, the calculation. The shift from passenger to something else. She walked the length of the cabin, as if counting steps, as if mapping terrain. Row by row, the air grew heavier. The smell changed. Coffee. Recycled breath. A crying baby somewhere near the back. She slid into 23C, knees brushing plastic, elbow boxed in, her coat folded carefully in her lap like a shield. Around her, the plane came back to life. Seatbelts clicked. Overhead bins slammed shut. The engines whined, then roared, a deep vibration that traveled up through the floor and into her bones. Susan Holloway watched from the front, a flicker of unease passing through her chest before she buried it. This was nothing, a routine call, the kind she had made 100 times, always for the greater good. First class had to be protected. Standards had to be maintained. People like Patricia Whitmore expected a certain atmosphere, and Susan had spent her life learning how to preserve it. In the forward galley, she leaned against the counter as the plane leveled off, exhaling slowly. Mark, the senior attendant flying with her, chuckled under his breath. "You handled that clean," he said. "Didn't even make a scene." Susan allowed herself a tight smile. "You can tell who belongs up there," she replied quietly. "Experience teaches you that." Mark snorted. "Yeah, some people just don't know their place." The words hung in the air longer than either of them noticed. 3 rows behind them, the woman in 23C stared straight ahead, her face composed, her hands still. In her mind, details arranged themselves with surgical precision. Names, phrases, timelines. The tone of Susan's voice, the hesitation in Jason's eyes, the casual cruelty in Mark's laugh. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim notebook, the kind with no markings on the cover. She didn't open it yet. Not here. Not now. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled to calm her child, cheeks flushed, eyes exhausted. The woman leaned over, offered a soft smile, helped retrieve a dropped pacifier. The mother mouthed thank you. Gratitude flickered, brief and bright. The woman settled back into her seat, the hum of the engines steady in her ears. Lorraine Brooks had spent most of her adult life being underestimated. She had learned, long ago, the value of patience, of letting people reveal themselves fully before stepping into the light. This flight was supposed to be quiet, anonymous, just another set of observations before a long day in Washington. Instead, it had given her something else entirely. As the plane cut through low morning clouds, sunlight flashing across the windows like a warning signal, Lorraine closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. She could already feel the weight of what was coming, the ripple this small, ugly moment would create. Up front, Patricia Whitmore accepted a glass of champagne with a satisfied sigh, completely unaware that the woman she had displaced was memorizing every sound in the cabin. The engines droned on, carrying them east, carrying them toward a reckoning none of them could yet imagine. The seatbelt sign chimed off, a soft electronic note that usually signaled relief. This time, it landed flat. Lorraine Brooks opened her eyes. The cabin noise swelled immediately. A cough, a laugh too loud, the rustle of newspapers. Somewhere ahead, glass clinked against glass, a sound that didn't belong to the same aircraft as the one she was sitting in. She didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where that sound came from. First class had begun its ritual. Susan Holloway moved through the forward cabin with practiced grace, her shoulders squared, her smile calibrated. She bent slightly as she poured, careful not to spill a drop. Patricia Whitmore accepted her champagne like a birthright, fingers heavy with rings, lips already pursed in mild dissatisfaction. "Thank you, Susan," Patricia said, lowering her voice just enough to sound gracious. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate you handling that situation." Susan laughed softly. "Of course. We try to keep things smooth up here." Patricia glanced toward the aisle curtain, then leaned closer. "Some people really don't understand how these spaces work anymore." Susan followed her gaze. For a fraction of a second, The image of Lorraine's face rose in her mind. Calm, unyielding, watching. She pushed it away. "Let me know if you need anything else," Susan said, straightening. "Anything at all." As she turned back toward the galley, Mark caught her eye. He raised an eyebrow, amused. Susan shrugged. "Routine, done." But as she reached the galley, the amusement faded. The cabin felt off. Not loud, not chaotic. Just tight. Like a room holding its breath. Mark leaned against the counter, scrolling on his phone. "You see her face," he muttered. "Didn't even flinch." Susan frowned. "Drop it." "I'm just saying," he went on. "Most people would have made a stink." Susan poured herself a small cup of water, hands steady. "That's because most people don't know when to back down." Mark smirked. "Or when they don't have leverage." The word lingered. Leverage. Susan took a sip. The water tasted faintly metallic. Back in 23C, Lorraine sat perfectly still, her back straight despite the cramped space. She listened. The rhythm of the plane, the patterns of movement, the absence of movement. 10 minutes passed. The call light above her seat glowed amber. Nothing happened. The baby across the aisle began to fuss again, a thin, reedy cry that scraped against Lorraine's nerves. The mother bounced gently, eyes darting toward the aisle, then the ceiling, then the glowing call light. Lorraine waited another minute, then another. She unbuckled. The man in the aisle seat shifted irritably as she stood. "You're blocking," he muttered. "I'll be quick," she said, already stepping past him. She walked forward, slow and deliberate, counting rows again. 22, 21. The air changed as she crossed the invisible border. Quieter, cooler, smoother. She reached the curtain and drew it back. Susan and Mark were in the galley, shoulders relaxed now, laughing over something on Mark's phone. The sound stopped abruptly when they saw her. Susan's expression hardened instantly, hospitality snapping into irritation like a switch. "What do you need?" she asked. Lorraine met her eyes. "I pressed my call button 10 minutes ago. I need water. So does the mother next to me." Susan exhaled sharply, exaggerated. "You can use the call button like everyone else. I did." Mark snorted. "We've been busy." Susan grabbed 2 plastic cups, filled them halfway, shoved them into Lorraine's hands. "Here, please return to your seat. You're not supposed to be up here." Lorraine didn't move. Susan felt the pause like a weight. "Is there a reason?" Lorraine asked calmly. "That you're both on personal devices while the aircraft is at cruising altitude?" Mark stiffened. Susan's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Lorraine glanced briefly at the phone still in Mark's hand, then back at Susan. "I'm asking a simple question." Susan laughed, sharp and humorless. "I think you're confused about your role here." "No," Lorraine said. "I'm very clear." Mark scoffed. "Unbelievable." Susan leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You've already been accommodated. Don't push it." Lorraine held her gaze for a long beat, long enough for Susan's smile to twitch. "Thank you for the water," Lorraine said finally. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Mark shook his head. The nerve. Susan stared at the curtain after it closed. Her heart was beating faster now, an uncomfortable rhythm she didn't like. "She thinks she's important," Mark added. "Probably got that ticket off Miles." Susan said nothing. She picked up her phone, stared at the dark screen, then set it face down on the counter. Back in her seat, Lorraine handed 1 cup to the young mother. The woman whispered, "Thank you," eyes shining with relief. Lorraine nodded once. She took a small notebook from her bag and opened it. The first line was already written. Not names, not accusations, just observations. Clean, factual, unemotional. She wrote another, then another. Up front, Patricia Whitmore shifted in her seat, adjusting her jacket. The champagne had gone to her head faster than she expected. She caught Susan's eye and motioned her over. "Everything all right?" Patricia asked. Susan hesitated, then smiled. "Of course." Patricia lowered her voice. "That woman, is she still causing trouble?" Susan glanced toward the curtain. "She's been persistent." Patricia reached into her purse, fingers brushing past lipstick and receipts until they found what she was looking for. She folded the bill once, neatly. "For your discretion," she said, slipping it into Susan's hand. "Some things are worth keeping contained." Susan froze. For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed to the feel of paper against her skin. She should have refused. She knew that. 30 years of training told her exactly what this was. Instead, she closed her fingers. "Thank you," she said softly. The words tasted wrong. The plane surged forward slightly, turbulence rattling the overhead bins. Somewhere behind them, Lorraine's pen paused mid-sentence. She looked up, eyes unfocused now, not seeing the cabin but something else entirely. A pattern. A line drawn cleanly from cause to effect. Susan tucked the bill into her pocket, forcing a smile as she turned away. Her stomach churned. She told herself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, a courtesy, something she'd done 100 times before. But this time, the unease didn't fade. It grew. And in row 23, Lorraine Brooks kept writing, her handwriting precise, her breathing steady, as the aircraft carried them closer to the moment when silence would no longer protect anyone. The turbulence passed, but the tension did not. Lorraine Brooks closed the notebook and slid it back into her bag, careful, deliberate. Writing was only one part of the work. The other part was listening, watching how people moved when they believed no one important was watching them. Across the aisle, the young mother finally coaxed her baby into sleep. The child's breath hitched, then settled. Relief softened the woman's face. She leaned back, eyes closing for a moment too long, the kind of exhaustion that came from doing everything alone. Lorraine noticed how no one from the front had checked on them. Not once. She noticed how Susan's footsteps never came this far back unless called, how the aisle became narrower here, the smiles thinner, how the rules bent quietly, not with malice, but with habit. Up front, Susan Holloway felt the bill in her pocket like a burn. She tried to focus on her checklist. Beverage service, cabin scan, prepare for mid-flight announcements. The motions were automatic, muscle memory carved by years in the air. But her mind kept circling back to the woman in 23C, to the way she had looked at Mark's phone, to the calm certainty in her voice. Susan had dealt with difficult passengers before, real ones, people who shouted, people who threatened lawsuits, people who demanded captains and supervisors and vouchers. This woman had done none of that. That unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "Hey," Mark said quietly, leaning close as they passed each other in the aisle. "You okay?" Susan nodded too quickly. "Fine." He smirked. "Relax. You did the right thing. You always do." She wished she believed him. Patricia Whitmore pressed the call button again, impatient. Susan was at her side in seconds. "I don't mean to complain," Patricia said, which was always how her complaints began. "But the cabin feels a little unsettled." Susan smiled. "Just light air, Mrs. Whitmore. Completely normal." Patricia leaned closer, voice dropping. "It's that woman, isn't it?" Susan hesitated. "Excuse me? "You know the one," Patricia said. "In the back. She has a look about her. Makes people uncomfortable." Susan glanced toward the curtain. "Everything is under control." Patricia nodded, satisfied. "Good. Because people like us shouldn't have to feel tense when we pay for peace. People like us." Susan felt the phrase lodge somewhere in her chest. She moved away, the smile fading the moment Patricia turned back to her window. In the galley, she caught her reflection in the stainless steel panel. The lines around her eyes looked deeper today. The confident woman she saw there didn't look quite as certain as she had that morning. At the back of the plane, Lorraine shifted in her seat as the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice said, smooth and practiced. "We're currently cruising at 37,000 feet. Weather ahead looks clear. We expect an on-time arrival into Washington." Lorraine noted the voice. Calm, unaware. She wondered how often captains knew what happened in their cabins, how often they were insulated by altitude and protocol. She reached into her bag again, not for the notebook this time, but for her phone. The screen lit up softly in her palm. She angled it away from curious eyes and typed carefully. No accusations, no conclusions, just facts. Times, behaviors, language. She sent the message and powered the phone down. In the forward galley, Mark's laughter rose suddenly, sharp and loud. Susan flinched. "What?" she asked. He waved his phone. "Just saw a thing online. People are ridiculous." Susan glanced at the screen despite herself, then looked away. "You shouldn't be on that." Mark rolled his eyes. "Relax, we're cruising." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. 30 years ago, she would have said something. Back when rules still felt solid. Back when the line between right and wrong didn't blur so easily in the name of comfort. She thought again of the bill in her pocket, of how quickly she had taken it, how natural it had felt. The plane hummed on, indifferent. Midway through the flight, Susan made another pass through economy, clipboard in hand, checking seat backs and tray tables. It was procedural. Necessary. When she reached row 23, Lorraine looked up. Their eyes met. Susan felt a strange flicker then. Not anger, not fear. Recognition, maybe. As if she were looking at someone who had already made a decision she herself was still avoiding. "Everything all right here?" Susan asked, the words automatic. "Yes," Lorraine replied. "Thank you for asking." Her tone was polite. Neutral. There was no challenge in it, no accusation. That somehow made it worse. Susan nodded and moved on, her steps quicker than before. She didn't notice the way Lorraine watched her go. Not with triumph, not with resentment, but with something closer to sadness. Lorraine turned her gaze back to the window. Far below, fields and rivers slid past in silence, patterns etched into the land by time and consequence. She thought of how often systems failed not because of villains, but because of ordinary people protecting small comforts. She thought of the young gate agent's eyes, of how quickly fear had overridden conscience. Jason Miller sat jump seat adjacent near the rear galley, staring at his hands. He had replayed the morning a dozen times already. The moment Susan had leaned in, the look she'd given him, the unspoken instruction. He told himself he had no choice, that it wasn't his call, that this was how things worked. But the woman's calm voice kept echoing in his head. "That's my seat." It had sounded less like a complaint and more like a statement of fact, a truth that didn't care whether he believed it or not. He shifted, swallowing hard, wishing he could go back and do something differently, anything differently. Up front, Patricia Whitmore finished her second drink and closed her eyes, satisfied. She thought of the meeting she was headed to, the people who would listen when she spoke, the doors that would open because of who she was married to, where she lived, how she dressed. She did not think of the woman in 23C at all. As the plane began its gradual descent, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. A quiet settled in, heavy and anticipatory. Susan took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and began her final checks. Everything looked fine. Everything always looked fine. Right up until it wasn't. Lorraine felt the shift in the aircraft's angle, the gentle pull in her stomach as they angled toward the ground. Her pulse quickened, not with nerves, but with certainty. The pieces were in place now, the picture clear. She rested her hands on her lap and waited. The runway lights would come soon. The wheels. The moment when forward motion slowed, and everything that had been contained in the air would have to land somewhere. And when it did, nothing would be as weightless as it had seemed at 37,000 feet. The wheels hit the runway harder than expected. The jolt rippled through the cabin, a low collective grunt rising from the seats as gravity reclaimed its claim. Overhead bins rattled. Somewhere, a cup tipped and spilled. The plane slowed, nose dipping, engines reversing with a roar that swallowed every private thought. Lorraine Brooks did not move. She counted the seconds between deceleration and silence. She always did. Old habit. In investigations, timing mattered. In truth, it mattered everywhere. Up front, Susan Holloway braced herself against the galley counter as the aircraft rolled toward the gate. Her heart was pounding now, and she did not know why. There had been no confrontation, no raised voices, no formal complaint. By every visible measure, the flight had gone smoothly. And yet... She glanced at the cockpit door, then at the aisle, then down at her pocket. The bill felt heavier than it had earlier, as if it had absorbed something from her hand, as if it knew. The seatbelt sign remained on. That was unusual. Passengers shifted, hands hovering near buckles, impatience crackling through the cabin. Patricia Whitmore was already standing halfway, phone pressed to her ear, irritation sharpening her features. "We've landed," she said sharply. "Yes, I know. I don't care. I have a driver waiting." Susan stepped forward. "Please remain seated, Mrs. Whitmore, just for a moment." Patricia lowered the phone, eyes narrowing. Why? Susan opened her mouth. Then the cockpit door opened. Not fully, just enough. A man in a dark jacket stepped out, his movements economical, deliberate. He did not smile. He did not rush. He scanned the cabin once, eyes sharp, then nodded back toward the cockpit. Behind him came another man, similar posture, similar expression. Both wore small badges clipped at their waists, the kind most people never noticed until it was too late. A hush spread through the aircraft. Susan felt the blood drain from her face. "This doesn't concern you," Patricia snapped, her voice cutting too loud through the sudden quiet. One of the men turned toward her. "Ma'am, please sit down." "Do you know who I am?" Patricia demanded. "Yes," the man said calmly. "And that's not relevant right now." Susan's breath came shallow. She looked toward the rear of the plane, a desperate instinct she didn't understand driving her gaze. Row 23. Lorraine Brooks unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood slowly, smoothing her coat, lifting her bag from beneath the seat. The man beside her stared, startled, as she stepped into the aisle. Heads turned. Whispers sparked and died. She walked forward with the same measured pace she had carried all flight. Not hurried, not hesitant. Each step firm, unremarkable, unstoppable. Susan watched her approach, dread blooming in her chest. She wanted to speak, to say something, to stop this from becoming what it felt like it was becoming. Lorraine stopped a few feet from the galley. The two men turned toward her instantly, their posture shifting in subtle acknowledgement. "Dr. Brooks," one of them said. "Thank you for your patience." The words hit the cabin like a dropped tray. Susan felt her knees weaken. Lorraine nodded once, Of course. She turned then, finally, to face Susan Holloway. Really face her. Not as a passenger, not as an inconvenience. As a fact. "My name is Lorraine Brooks," she said, her voice steady, carrying without effort. "I serve as Acting Inspector General for Civil Aviation Oversight." A murmur rippled through the cabin, confusion and disbelief tangling together. Susan's mouth opened. No sound came out. "You reassigned my confirmed first-class seat without cause," Lorraine continued. "You directed a subordinate to alter boarding documentation. You accepted a monetary gratuity in connection with that decision. And you did so while exercising authority granted to you by a federally regulated carrier." Each sentence landed cleanly, precise, final. Susan shook her head faintly. "I didn't know," she whispered. Lorraine held her gaze. "That," she said quietly, "is the point." Patricia Whitmore's face had gone pale. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice brittle now. "You can't just—" One of the men raised a hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, you will be asked a few questions shortly. Please remain seated." Lorraine turned slightly, addressing the cabin now, not loudly, but with a gravity that commanded attention. "No one here is under arrest. No one is being accused of a crime at this moment. We are beginning a review. That is all." She looked back at Susan. "Miss Holloway, you are temporarily relieved of duty pending that review." Susan's eyes filled. Not with anger, with something like grief. 30 years collapsed into a single sentence. "I was just trying to do my job," she said hoarsely. Lorraine nodded once. "So was I." The engines powered down. The familiar ding of arrival never came. In the silence that followed, Jason Miller stood frozen near the rear galley, watching the scene unfold with a hollow ache in his chest. He saw Susan's shoulders slump. He saw Patricia's composure crack. And he knew, with a clarity that burned, that the choice he had made that morning would follow him for the rest of his life. Lorraine Brooks stepped aside as the men began their quiet work, her role complete for now. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the heavy knowledge of what this moment would cost everyone involved. Outside the windows, the terminal lights glowed steadily, indifferent. Inside the cabin, a reckoning had landed, and it would not stop here. They were still seated when the jet bridge finally connected. The usual release never came, no applause, no shuffling rush toward the aisle. People sat frozen, hands on armrests, eyes darting between the front of the cabin and the aisle, where authority had just taken physical shape. Lorraine Brooks stood near the galley, slightly to the side now, no longer the center of the frame, yet unmistakably its gravity. She had learned long ago that power did not need to announce itself repeatedly. Once was enough. One of the men spoke quietly into a radio clipped near his collar. Another stepped back into the cockpit. Doors remained closed. Susan Holloway was guided to a jump seat near the front. Not escorted, not restrained, just repositioned. That, somehow, made it worse. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. She stared at the floor, at a dark scuff mark she didn't remember being there before. Her mind replayed the morning in brutal fragments. The glance, the assumption, the ease with which she had acted, the bill in her pocket. She felt foolish now, not because she had been caught, but because she had never imagined needing to be careful. Patricia Whitmore sat rigid in 1A, phone clenched in her hand like a weapon that no longer worked. She had stopped calling. There was no one left to impress in this cabin, no one who would be moved by her voice or her name. When an agent approached her, she looked up sharply. "I want my attorney." "You're free to contact counsel," he replied calmly. "Right now, we're just documenting." "Documenting what?" she snapped. "Everything," he said. Jason Miller stood near the rear galley, invisible in the chaos, which suited him just fine. He felt exposed anyway. as if every thought he tried to bury had risen to the surface and printed itself on his face. He watched Lorraine speak briefly with the agents, watched her nod, watched her listen more than she talked. This is what it looks like, he thought. Real authority. Quiet. Unimpressed. Passengers were finally allowed to deplane in small groups, starting from the back. No announcements, no apologies. Just soft instructions, repeated gently, as if calm alone might erase what had happened. Lorraine waited until nearly everyone had passed her. She watched faces as they went by. Confusion, curiosity, relief. A few glances held something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or guilt. The young mother stopped briefly, shifting her sleeping child on her shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered again, unsure why she felt the need to say it now. Lorraine smiled faintly. "You're welcome." Outside the aircraft, the terminal buzzed with the ordinary life of an airport. Rolling suitcases, loudspeaker announcements, the smell of coffee and disinfectant. It felt jarringly normal. Susan Holloway was escorted, not through the public concourse, but down a side corridor she had used countless times herself. She knew every turn, every badge reader, every emergency exit sign. This time, she noticed how narrow it all felt. In a small operations room near the gate, she sat alone while paperwork was retrieved. No accusations were read, no threats made. Just silence. And in that silence, the weight of her own choices finally settled. She thought of the first day she'd put on the uniform, of how proud she'd been, of the rules she'd memorized, believing they were there to protect her. She had followed them, mostly, bent them sometimes, for efficiency, for comfort, for people like Patricia Whitmore. She had told herself it was harmless. Now she wasn't so sure. Across the terminal, Lorraine Brooks walked with one of the agents toward a quiet conference space. Her steps were measured, but inside, the tempo had not slowed. If anything, it had sharpened. She was already thinking ahead. Patterns, precedents, training records, complaint histories. This flight was not an anomaly. It was a sample. She knew what came next. Interviews, audits, resistance dressed up as cooperation, press statements full of regret and reform. She had seen it all before. But this time, there was something different. Not in the system, in herself. She paused briefly near a window overlooking the tarmac. Another aircraft taxied past, sunlight glinting off its fuselage. A machine built on trust, on the assumption that everyone involved took their responsibilities seriously. She thought of how easily that trust eroded. Patricia Whitmore was released after a short conversation, her composure frayed. She walked quickly, heels clicking too loud, phone pressed to her ear again. Her voice was sharp now, defensive, the language of someone unused to being questioned. Jason Miller was asked to stay. He sat across from an agent at a small table, hands clasped, voice barely steady. He told the truth, not to absolve himself, but because lying felt impossible now. "I knew it was wrong," he said. I didn't think I could say no." The agent nodded, making notes. "Why?" Jason swallowed. "Because people like her decide if you keep flying, or if you disappear." The agent looked up at him then, really looked. "And what do you think now?" Jason stared at the table. That disappearing might have been easier. In another room, Susan Holloway signed a document, acknowledging her temporary removal from duty. Her hand shook as she wrote her name. 30 years of muscle memory couldn't steady it. When she stood, she felt older than she ever had in uniform. Older than the job she had given her life to. She caught her reflection in the glass door as it closed behind her. For the first time, she did not recognize the woman looking back. Lorraine entered the operations room a short time later. Susan looked up instinctively, something tightening in her chest. They faced each other in silence. Lorraine spoke first. You won't be charged today. Susan nodded, a hollow relief passing through her before it curdled into something else. I understand. Lorraine studied her, not coldly, not kindly, just thoroughly. Do you? Susan hesitated. Then, quietly, I thought I was maintaining standards. Lorraine's voice was calm. Whose standards? Susan had no answer. That question, Lorraine said, is where this actually begins. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. This won't end your life, but it will change how you see it. That part is unavoidable. Susan closed her eyes. When she opened them, Lorraine was gone. Outside, the terminal lights hummed on as the day wore forward, indifferent to moral reckoning. Flights departed, arrivals continued, systems moved, as they always did. But beneath the routine, something had shifted. Lorraine Brooks walked toward her next meeting, her phone vibrating once in her pocket. She didn't check it. She already knew what it would say. This was no longer about one seat, or one flight, or one woman's assumptions. This was about a culture that had mistaken comfort for correctness, and silence for consent. And for the first time in a long while, the system had looked directly at itself. The story was no longer contained within the cabin. It was airborne now. The conference room had no windows. That was intentional. Lorraine Brooks preferred spaces like this. No skyline, no distractions. Just faces, voices, and the truth, stripped of performance. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as she took her seat at the narrow table, jacket folded neatly beside her, hands resting flat on the surface. Across from her sat two representatives from Liberty American Airlines Regional Compliance Office, both men in their late 40s, both wearing the practiced stillness of people trained to say as little as possible. Outside, the airport continued its rhythm. Inside, time slowed. We appreciate your cooperation, one of the men began, voice careful. We understand there was an unfortunate misunderstanding on board. Lorraine didn't interrupt. She let the word misunderstanding hang there, unsupported, until the man shifted in his chair. This isn't a disciplinary hearing, Lorraine said finally. Her tone was level, controlled. It's a fact-gathering session. The second man nodded too quickly. Of course. Lorraine slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Not a report, not an accusation, just a timeline. Minutes, actions, decisions. I want you to walk me through your training protocols, she said. Specifically, how discretion is taught when it intersects with customer accommodation. Silence. The first man cleared his throat. Our crews are instructed to prioritize safety and customer satisfaction. Lorraine tilted her head slightly. In that order? Another pause. In practice, the second man said, choosing his words, our senior cabin staff are given latitude to manage premium environments. Latitude, Lorraine repeated. She leaned back then, folding her hands. Tell me, she said, how often that latitude results in documented deviations from policy? Neither man answered. Lorraine didn't press. She didn't need to. Their silence was already a response. Down the hall, Jason Miller sat alone, staring at the carpet. The pattern reminded him of waves, endless, repeating. He wondered how many times he had walked over floors like this without notice, how many decisions had been made quietly, without consequence. Until now. An agent stepped into the room. Ms. Brooks is ready for you. Jason's heart lurched. He stood, legs stiff, and followed. Lorraine looked up as he entered. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. He did. She didn't open with questions. She studied him for a moment instead. his posture, the way his hands clasped together too tightly, the exhaustion behind his eyes. "You were working the gate this morning," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You printed the reassigned boarding pass?" "Yes." "Why?" Jason swallowed. "Because I was told to." Lorraine nodded once. "By whom?" "Susan Holloway." "And you knew it was wrong?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Lorraine waited. "I didn't think I had a choice," he said quietly. She controls schedules, evaluations, who gets transferred, who gets stuck." Lorraine's voice was calm. "So fear made the decision?" Jason's shoulders sagged. "Yes." Lorraine leaned forward slightly. "Fear is a powerful motivator. It keeps systems running long after they've stopped being just." Jason looked up at her then, surprised. "I'm not here to punish fear," she continued. "I'm here to understand how it's cultivated." She slid another document toward him, this one thicker. "This is a voluntary statement. You can take your time, you can request counsel, or you can tell the truth now." Jason stared at the paper. His hands trembled. "I don't want to be that person again," he said finally. "The one who looks away." Lorraine nodded. "Then don't." He picked up the pen. Across the terminal, Susan Holloway sat alone in a small office, staring at a framed photograph on the wall. A retirement plaque mock-up, her name etched in gold. 3 decades of service reduced to a placeholder. She had been given water, offered a seat, treated with courtesy, and yet she felt more exposed than she ever had in the cabin. Her phone buzzed, a message from Mark. She didn't open it. Instead, she closed her eyes and tried to remember when discretion had stopped meaning judgment and started meaning avoidance. When protecting the experience had begun to mean excluding the wrong people. She remembered the woman's eyes. Not angry, not pleading, watching. In the conference room, Lorraine Brooks concluded the session with the compliance officers. No raised voices, no threats, just a final statement, delivered without ornament. "This flight will be referenced in a broader review," she said. "Training materials, promotion criteria, complaint handling, all of it." The men nodded, pale now. "This is not about one crew member," Lorraine continued. "It's about patterns that have been tolerated because they were comfortable." She stood. "Comfort is not a defense." As she stepped into the hallway, her phone vibrated again. This time she checked it. A short message. Internal, confirming what she already expected. "Preliminary approval granted. Scope expanded." Lorraine exhaled slowly. The system always resisted at first. Then it adapted. Or it broke. She walked toward the exit, heels echoing softly against the floor, the sound steady, unhurried. Behind her, doors closed. Statements were signed. Careers tilted. Ahead of her, Washington waited. And with it, the work that came after the moment everyone remembered. The work that lasted. By the time the sun slipped behind the terminal glass, the story had already outgrown the flight. Lorraine Brooks stood at the edge of the airport parking structure, phone pressed to her ear, listening more than speaking. The wind cut across the concrete levels, carrying the distant roar of departing jets. Every sound felt amplified now, as if the city itself were leaning in. "Yes," she said quietly. "Level 2 review. Limited to service protocols and internal escalation pathways for now. No public notice." A pause. A voice on the other end, careful, respectful. "I'm aware," Lorraine continued. "That's why it matters." She ended the call and stared out at the tarmac. Aircraft lights blinked in orderly patterns, red and white against the darkening sky. From a distance, everything looked disciplined, controlled, safe. Up close, she knew better. Inside the terminal, Susan Holloway walked slowly toward the exit reserved for staff. Her badge had already been deactivated. She'd discovered that when the scanner refused to recognize her, the small red light blinking like a quiet accusation. A supervisor she barely knew let her through without comment. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before. Her shoes echoed too loudly. She wondered how many times she'd walked this same path without ever noticing the way the walls closed in near the end. At home, that evening, Susan didn't turn on the television. She sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, staring at nothing. Her uniform lay folded on the chair beside her, immaculate, useless. She replayed the day in fragments. Not the confrontation, not the agents. The moment that haunted her was earlier, at the gate, when she'd decided she didn't need to ask a question. She told herself she'd been protecting the airline, protecting the experience, protecting order. But beneath that, uncomfortably close to the surface, was a simpler truth. She had assumed. Jason Miller didn't sleep at all. He lay on his couch, the city humming faintly outside his window, the ceiling fan ticking overhead. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Susan's face at the gate. Not angry. Certain. The kind of certainty that made resistance feel childish. He'd signed the statement, every word of it. Fear, pressure, unspoken rules. It was all there in black ink. His phone buzzed shortly after midnight. A message from an unfamiliar number. "Thank you for your honesty today. That matters." No signature. None needed. Jason stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone down. The relief he felt was immediate and sickening. Like stepping out of a storm, only to realize how cold you'd been. Across town, Patricia Whitmore sat in the back seat of her car, staring out at the blur of streetlights. Her driver kept his eyes on the road, wisely silent. Her phone rested in her lap, dark. No messages, no callbacks. She had left 3 voicemails already, each more controlled than the last. This was not how things were supposed to go. People like her didn't get questioned. They made the calls. They smoothed things over. They donated to the right causes and sat on the right boards and kept inconveniences contained. The woman on the plane hadn't raised her voice, hadn't threatened, hadn't even seemed angry. And yet here Patricia was, unsettled, her name now sitting in someone else's notes. She crossed her arms tightly, as if to hold herself together. Lorraine Brooks arrived at her hotel just after 10. She dropped her bag by the door and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. Her phone buzzed again, once, then twice. She didn't answer either. Instead, she took out her notebook. She wrote slowly, deliberately, capturing impressions that wouldn't fit into reports. The way Susan's confidence had fractured. The way Jason's voice had steadied once he committed to telling the truth. The way Patricia had looked, for the first time, unsure whether her status would protect her. These were not violations. They were symptoms. She closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This was the dangerous part. Not the investigation itself, but what came after, when systems realized they were being seen. Pushback would come. Carefully worded emails, calls framed as concerns, offers of cooperation that quietly sought limits. She welcomed it. In another part of the city, Liberty American's regional office remained lit long past closing. 2 executives sat across from each other, jackets off, ties loosened, the weight of the day etched into their faces. "This doesn't need to get bigger," one of them said. "It's a service issue. We handle it internally." The other shook his head. "She's Inspector General. Acting or not, she doesn't file reports unless she's already seen a pattern." "There is no pattern," the first snapped. Silence followed. Then, quieter. "Isn't there?" They both knew the answer. At the hotel, Lorraine finally turned on the lamp. Warm light filled the room, softening the edges of everything. She checked her messages now. One from her deputy, one from legal, one from a Senate staffer she hadn't heard from in months. All careful, all measured, all paying attention. She typed a single response and sent it. Proceed quietly, no statements. Let the facts speak. She set the phone aside and allowed herself, briefly, to feel the weight of it all, the responsibility, the inevitability. People often thought moments like this were about power, about exposure, about winning. They were wrong. They were about choices made long before anyone noticed, about habits calcified into culture, about the cost of comfort. Lorraine lay back on the bed, eyes open, listening to the muted sounds of the city through the window. Somewhere, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, another plane took off, climbing smoothly into the dark. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Interviews, reviews, resistance. But tonight, the system was unsettled. And once unsettled, it never truly went back to sleep. The first headline appeared the next morning, small and cautious, buried beneath weather and traffic. Airline conduct under review after passenger complaint. Lorraine Brooks read it on her phone while standing in line for coffee. She didn't react. She never did to early headlines. They were probes, not conclusions. Signals sent out to see who flinched. Behind her, two men in suits murmured about the market opening. Someone complained about the price of eggs. Life continued, indifferent. By mid-morning, the language shifted. Federal Oversight Office confirms preliminary inquiry into Liberty American. That one carried weight. At Liberty American's headquarters, the executive floor felt tighter than usual. Doors closed more often. Conversations dropped when someone entered the room. The compliance inbox flooded with messages flagged urgent, high priority, confidential. A conference call was hastily assembled. No agenda. No names on the invite list beyond titles. "We need to get ahead of this," someone said, voice strained through the speaker. "Control the narrative." Another voice, older, steadier. "There is no narrative yet. That's exactly the problem." Susan Holloway watched the coverage from her living room, wrapped in a cardigan she hadn't worn in years. The uniform was gone now, sealed in a garment bag in the closet, like a relic from another life. She heard her name once, just once, mispronounced, followed by the phrase, "senior crew member." Her stomach twisted. She muted the television and sat in silence, hands folded, posture still perfect despite everything. She had spent decades being the face of reassurance. Now she was a blur in the background of a story she couldn't stop. Her phone buzzed. Mark's name flashed on the screen. She let it ring. Jason Miller saw the headline while riding the bus to a meeting he hadn't expected to attend. His stomach dropped. He reread the article twice, then a third time, looking for details that weren't there. No names, no accusations. Yet. At the meeting, a human resources representative sat across from him, tone measured, sympathetic. They thanked him for his cooperation. They told him his position was under review, pending the outcome of the inquiry. Jason nodded, jaw tight. He had rehearsed this moment in his head all night. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," the representative said gently, "that you did the right thing, and there may still be consequences." Jason swallowed. "I understand." He left the building lighter and heavier at the same time. Across town, Patricia Whitmore's name did not appear in any article. That fact comforted her briefly. She told herself it meant the system was working, that discretion still existed. Then her assistant knocked on the door, pale. "Your husband's office called," she said quietly. "They want to speak with you. Immediately." Patricia's breath caught. "About what?" They didn't say. The phone call was short, controlled. devastating. "You need to stop talking," her husband said, voice low and urgent. "To everyone. Right now." "I didn't do anything wrong," Patricia snapped. "You don't get to decide that," he replied. "Not anymore." The line went dead. Patricia stared at the phone, her reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. For the first time, the possibility crept in that this wasn't about optics, that it wouldn't be handled quietly, that the woman on the plane hadn't been an inconvenience. She had been a warning. Lorraine Brooks spent the day in meetings, windowless rooms, legal counsel, policy advisors. No raised voices, no drama. Just documents sliding across tables, questions asked twice in different ways, patterns forming with each answer. By late afternoon, the shape of it was clear. This was not an isolated incident. It never was. Customer accommodation logs showed anomalies. Too many quiet adjustments. Too few explanations. Complaints that vanished into internal review with no resolution. Senior crew members shielded by discretion. Junior staff conditioned to comply. Lorraine closed the folder and leaned back. "Next steps?" someone asked. "We expand," she said, carefully. There was a pause. "This will be disruptive." "Yes," Lorraine replied. "That's the point." That evening, Susan Holloway sat at her kitchen table again, a legal pad in front of her. She had started writing earlier, then stopped, unsure who she was writing for. An apology? A defense? A confession? None of it felt right. She thought of the question Lorraine had asked her. Whose standards? Susan pressed her pen to the paper and began again, slower this time. Not to justify, to remember. To trace when she had stopped asking that question herself. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on. Somewhere nearby, a plane passed overhead, unseen but unmistakable. Susan followed its sound until it faded, her chest tightening with a grief she hadn't expected. The sky, she realized, didn't belong to her anymore. And somewhere downtown, in an office still lit long after closing, Lorraine Brooks reviewed one final memo before heading out into the night. The system was moving now. Slowly, reluctantly, but it was moving. And once it did, there would be no returning to the quiet assumptions that had carried so many people for so long. The backlash did not come all at once. It never did. It arrived quietly, dressed as concern. Lorraine Brooks felt it before she could name it. The subtle shift in tone during calls. The extra pauses before answers. The way people began prefacing statements with phrases like, "with all due respect," or "just for context." Language designed not to argue, but to soften resistance into something socially acceptable. At Liberty American, a carefully worded internal memo went out to all staff. It spoke of values, of inclusion, of listening. It emphasized patience while the review was ongoing and reminded employees to direct all media inquiries to corporate communications. It said nothing about responsibility. Susan Holloway read the memo twice, then a third time. Each sentence slid past her like water over glass and was the kind of message she herself had helped draft dozens of times over the years. The kind that sounded reassuring while promising nothing. She set the paper down and looked around her kitchen. The space felt unfamiliar now, as if she was seeing it from the outside. She had always defined herself by motion, by schedules and gates and aircraft types. Without those, the hours stretched strangely, unmarked. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she answered. It was her sister, older by 2 years, retired schoolteacher, a woman who had marched when marching cost something. "They're saying your name on the news," her sister said, not accusing, just factual. Susan closed her eyes. "I know." A pause. Then, "Is it true?" Susan thought of Lorraine's face, the calm, the disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "Yes," she said. Her sister exhaled slowly. "Then listen carefully. This isn't about whether you meant harm. It's about what you protected when you chose not to look." The line went quiet. Susan sat there long after the call ended, the truth of it settling into her bones. She had protected comfort, familiarity, a version of order that asked nothing of her except silence. Jason Miller faced his own version of the reckoning. He sat across from two managers he barely recognized, both younger than him, both careful with their words. They thanked him again for cooperating. They told him his contract would not be renewed. "It's not punitive," one of them said. "It's procedural." Jason nodded. He had expected this. Still, the finality hit hard. "What happens now?" he asked. The other manager shrugged slightly. "You move on." Jason left the building with a box under his arm, the sky wide and bright above him. For a moment, anger flared. Then something else took its place. A strange, reluctant pride. He had told the truth. Across the city, Patricia Whitmore attended a luncheon she had hosted for years. Same venue, same table, same polite smiles, but the room felt altered, as if an invisible line had been crossed. Conversation stopped when she approached. Eyes flicked away more often than usual. No one mentioned the flight. No one needed to. Power, Patricia was learning, depended on consensus, and consensus was fragile. That afternoon, Lorraine Brooks sat in a Senate office she had visited many times before, though never like this. The staffers across from her were polite, curious, alert. "We've reviewed your preliminary findings," one of them said. "There's concern this could escalate." Lorraine met his gaze. "It already has." Another staffer leaned forward. "This could become political." Lorraine nodded. "Everything does, eventually." Silence followed. "What are you asking for?" the first staffer said. Lorraine folded her hands. "Time, access, and the understanding that what I'm examining isn't an airline problem. It's a cultural one." The staffer studied her for a long moment. "You're saying this isn't about one incident?" "I'm saying," Lorraine replied, "that this incident happened because no one thought it mattered." The meeting ended without resolution, but it ended without dismissal. That, Lorraine knew, was progress. That night, she walked alone along the Potomac, the water dark and slow beneath the lights. She thought of the woman she had been early in her career, the fights she had chosen, the ones she had avoided. People liked to believe change arrived with noise, with confrontation, with heroes. More often, it arrived this way, incremental, uncomfortable, carried by people willing to sit in rooms and refuse to look away. She stopped at the railing and looked out over the river, reflections fractured by movement, never settling into a single image. Behind her, the city hummed on, unaware of the quiet pressure building beneath its systems. The backlash would continue. Pushback, doubt, attempts to minimize. Lorraine welcomed all of it, because backlash meant something had shifted. And once a system began to resist, it had already started to change. The hearing room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of place where decisions outlived the people who made them. Lorraine Brooks sat at the witness table alone, her back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. The seal on the wall behind her caught the light, an emblem meant to suggest permanence. She knew better. Permanence was a myth. Systems survived only as long as people protected them. Across the room, Liberty Americans leadership occupied a row they had never imagined sitting in. The chief executive officer, Daniel Mercer, looked smaller without the stage lighting and scripted confidence. His suit was impeccable. His jaw was tight. He had flown in on a private charter that morning, believing distance still conferred insulation. It did not. Lorraine began without preamble. She spoke slowly, deliberately, her voice carrying without strain. She described the flight, not theatrically, not emotionally, just as it had happened. A reassigned seat, a discretionary decision, a cash gratuity accepted under the cover of courtesy, a junior employee frozen by fear, a senior employee convinced that comfort justified exclusion. The room listened because the details were mundane, familiar, impossible to dismiss as an anomaly. She paused, allowing the silence to do its work. What matters, she continued, is not intent. It is pattern. This airline did not fail because one person acted poorly. It failed because many people learned that acting poorly would be tolerated, as long as it preserved a certain experience. A murmur rippled through the audience. Daniel Mercer shifted, then leaned toward his counsel. Lorraine noticed. She always noticed. When questions came, they were cautious at first. Process, scope, authority. She answered each one, her tone even, her language precise. She cited training manuals, internal memos, complaint logs that ended in quiet closures. She never raised her voice. She did not need to. Then the chair recognized Daniel Mercer. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and offered the room a practiced expression of regret. He spoke of values, of diversity initiatives, of personal disappointment. He spoke well. He always had. Lorraine listened, head tilted slightly, as if weighing something unseen. When he finished, she leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "how many times have you personally approved exceptions for premium customers in the past year?" He blinked. "I don't involve myself in—" "How many?" she repeated gently. "A beat." "I couldn't say." Lorraine nodded. "Your chief operating officer reported that you authorized expedited accommodations on at least 20 occasions, each time documented as preserving brand experience." Mercer's mouth tightened. "Experience," Lorraine continued, "is not a substitute for equity. And discretion is not a license to discriminate." She sat back. The chair thanked her. The record was closed. Outside, cameras waited. Lorraine did not stop for them. She walked past the lights and questions with the same calm she had carried down the aisle weeks earlier. Inside the building, staffers moved quickly now, aware that something irreversible had occurred. The findings were released that afternoon. Not sensational, thorough. A multi-year compliance monitor installed, mandatory retraining tied to promotions, a revised escalation protocol that removed unilateral discretion from cabin leadership, fines that would be absorbed but not forgotten, and a condition, added quietly at the end, that the chief executive officer would step aside pending board review. Daniel Mercer resigned before sunset. Susan Holloway watched the news from her living room, the sound low. She did not feel vindicated or condemned. She felt older, wiser in a way she would have once resisted. When the anchor spoke of culture, Susan understood what that meant now. Culture was the sum of the choices no one questioned. She folded her uniform carefully and placed it in a box. Not to hide it, to acknowledge it. Jason Miller started a new job 2 weeks later, inventory control at a distribution center near the river. The work was quiet, honest. He missed the airport sometimes, the motion, the sense of departure. But when he slept at night, he slept without rehearsing apologies he would never give. Patricia Whitmore withdrew from the boards she once chaired. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. She told herself she was tired of the scene anyway. The lie settled uneasily. She learned, late, that proximity was not immunity. Liberty American changed its name by the end of the quarter. New branding, new messaging. The same planes repainted. Lorraine read the announcement and set it aside. Names were surface. Structure was substance. On a clear morning, weeks later, Lorraine boarded another flight. Same route, different airline.
She took her seat without incident.
The cabin filled. The door closed on time. A young flight attendant paused beside her row, smiled, and offered water without being asked. His hands were steady. His eyes were attentive. He did not assess her worth. He did his job. As the aircraft climbed, Lorraine looked out the window. The city receded, lines blurring into pattern. She felt no triumph, only resolve. The work would continue, unevenly, imperfectly, carried by people willing to be uncomfortable in rooms without windows. When the plane leveled, she opened her notebook and wrote a single line. Not a conclusion, a reminder. Systems do not change because they are exposed. They change because someone refuses to look away. If this story resonated with you, like the video, subscribe for more, and comment with 3 words. Hold them accountable.